Chapter 10 of Dynamic Thought, or the Law of Vibrant Energy, by William Walker Atkinson. The Law of Attraction. In the previous chapters we have seen that all forms of radiant energy, viz., light, heat, electricity, and magnetism, arose from the motion of the particles of substance. It now becomes important to learn just what caused this motion of the particles. Science is somewhat hazy and foggy on this subject, but in a general way decides that it is caused by the mutual relations and positions of the particles arising from their respective attractive qualities, as a recent writer has expressed it. Well, this is better than the old way of seeking refuge and retreat in a mere volume of dense words. It is, indeed, the only logical conclusion, this one, that the operations of the law of attraction are manifested in the motion of the particles. The great law of attraction is the greatest law in nature. It operates on all planes of life. It is always in evidence. Let us consider it. Let us begin by considering the most magnificent and constant exhibition of that law, gravitation. Gravitation is the riddle of the universe, and the one form of energy that balks science, so much a mystery that science does not even hazard a guess at its nature. No theory of the origin and nature of gravitation is to be found in the books. Let us see what gravitation is. It is more than the power that pulls things to the earth, as the average man would define it. It does more than cause water to run downhill and turn mill wheels to drive machinery. Water power results from gravitation, but even the energy of Niagara Falls is insignificant when compared to the other manifestations of the mother of energy, gravitation. Webster defines gravitation as that attraction or force by which all bodies or particles in the universe tend toward each other. Following that definition, let us add that every particle of substance has an attraction for every other particle. In view of our belief that this attraction is a form of mental effort, let us regard the term attraction as being a form of what we call desire, or even love, in the mental world. If you will think of it in this way, you will be better able to fall in with our lines of thought. And in addition to every particle of substance having an attraction, love or desire, for every other particle, it has the means and power to draw that other particle toward itself and to move toward that other particle at the same time. Webster gives a very clear idea of this when he defines attraction as an invisible power in a body by which it draws anything to itself, the power in nature acting mutually between bodies, or ultimate particles tending to draw them together or to produce their cohesion or combination, and conversely resisting separation. The majority of persons, when thinking of gravitation, are satisfied with the idea that it is a power that pulls things down to the ground, and do not think of it as a force that pulls things other ways besides down, and which is possessed and exercised by the speck of dust as well as by the whole earth, by the molecule as well as by the mass. The reason of this is that this power is so slight in small bodies of substance that it is unnoticed, and that only when the mass is sufficiently large to make the pull strong does one perceive and appreciate that the force exists. The lack of information on the part of the average person regarding this subject is amazing, particularly when the importance of the knowledge is understood. The attraction that holds the molecules of substance together is gravitation. The attraction that pulls a piece of substance to the earth is gravitation. The action that keeps the suns and planets in their orbits is gravitation. Let us see the operations of the law. In astronomy, you may learn that the movements of the planets around the sun and the moons around their planets, their regular and constant relative positions, are caused by the force of gravitation. If it were not for this attraction by the sun, the planets would fly out into space like a stone from a sling. The attraction of gravitation acts on the planets just as does the string of the whirling sling that keeps the stone from flying away during the whirling until the string is released. Some astronomers think that our sun revolves around some greater sun, and this again around a greater, and so on to infinity. If this be so, then the attraction of gravitation is that which holds them all in their orbits and places in spite of their motion. And in physics you may learn that this same attraction of gravitation prevents the people and objects on the surface of the earth from flying off into space, and that it holds the portions of the earth together, preventing them from flying apart. And remember this, for it is important. The attraction of the earth, great and powerful as it is nothing more than the combined attractive power of its constituent molecules or atoms or parts. The center of the earth is the center of the attraction because it is the center of the aggregation of its particles. It must not be supposed that the earth simply attracts downward, that is, toward its center. On the contrary, large masses of earth, large mountains for instance, exert a certain degree of attraction of gravitation, and experiments have shown that a plum is slightly deflected by reason of the proximity of a large mountain. And the reason that bodies lose weight as they descend from the surface of the earth is because they leave above them a certain large portion of the molecules composing the earth, which mass of molecules exert an attraction proportionate to their mass, which attraction balances the attraction of the mass of earth beneath them. Science teaches that if the earth were hollow in the center, the weight there would be zero, or nothing at all, and that a body would float in the space at the center of the earth, just as does a balloon in the air, the reason thereof being that the attraction would be equalized, equal attraction from every direction counterbalancing each other. Considering the earth's radius to be 4,000 miles, a body that weighed 100 pounds on the surface would weigh but 75 pounds at the depth of 1,000 miles, but 50 pounds at a depth of 2,000 miles, but 25 pounds at a depth of 3,000 miles, and nothing or zero at a depth of 4,000 miles, which would be the center of the earth. This, of course, supposes that the substance of which the earth is composed is of uniform density from surface to center. From an equal distance above the surface of the earth, bodies released or dropped will reach the surface at exactly the same degree of speed and in exactly the same time, this irrespective of weight or size. In other words, a cork or piece of lead, no matter what their sizes may be, will travel with equal rapidity. In case where the lighter substance travels more slowly, compare a feather and bullet for instance, the difference is caused by the light object meeting with more resistance from the air. The apparent exception has been explained away by the experiment of dropping the bullet and the feather in a vacuum tube, in which there is no resistance from air, the consequence being that both descended precisely at the same instant. Another similar experiment is to place the feather upon a piece of iron whereby the resistance of the air is prevented, and the feather will maintain its position during the drop and will reach the ground resting on top of the iron, just as it started. And, remember this please, that the small object attracted by the earth exerts an attraction on its own account. If the two were of the same size they would exert an equal attracting power. But as one is similar, its attracting power is very slight compared with that of the large mass. But it is true that the particle of dust attracts the earth precisely as the earth attracts the particle of dust, the difference being solely a matter of degree depending upon the mass of the body. The amount or degree of the combined attracting power is determined by the combined total of the two masses. Distance lessens the degree of attraction. Thus, as bodies are lifted above the earth, the weight decreases very gradually, and by very slight degrees, but constantly and invariably. The poles of the earth are flattened, and consequently the weight of an object slightly increases as it is carried from equator to pole. Concluding our consideration of gravitation, it will be well to call your attention to the fact that gravitation differs from the forms of radiant energy known as heat, light, electricity, and magnetism in several very important particulars, which seems to go far in the direction of proof that the latter are by incidents or consequences of the former. In the first place, gravitation, so far as is known, is not dependent upon, caused by, or maintained by any other force or form of energy. Nor does it seem to be derived from some great reservoir, from which it obtains its supply of energy. On the contrary, it seems to be a thing in itself, self-supporting, self-existing, an intrinsic thing, in fact. It does not seem to be lost to bodies by radiation, and consequently there seems to be no need of a body replenishing its supply, as there is no loss. Gravitation seems to be a constant something, remaining always with bodies and neither being lost or acquired. It exists between the atoms, molecules, masses, all in the same way. In fact, one is tempted to think of the planets and worlds in space as molecules of some greater mass held together by gravitation, just as are the molecules held together. Remember that the molecules and atoms are not in absolute contact, but there is always a space between them, although the space or distance may be insensible to us. As above, so below, says the old occult aphorism, and it seems to be so. Then again, gravitation is believed to act instantaneously, and does not require time to pass between bodies, as does light, heat, electricity, magnetism, radiant energy. Light travels through the ether as light waves at the rate of 184,000 miles a second. The same is true of heat and of electricity, but gravitation travels instantaneously. For instance, if a new star were to spring into existence at some inconceivable distance from the earth, it would require thousands of years for its light to reach us. But its attraction of gravitation would be felt instantly. Do you realize what this means? It means that gravitation is in some way connected with the ether or conveying medium, that an impulse communicated at some point of space, trillions of miles away, is felt at once at our point in space, and vice versa. There is some awful mystery here, and the laws of substance and force, as generally understood, do not account for it. And the theories regarding the ether do not throw light upon it. But wait a bit. But more than this, science holds that gravitation does not require a medium, that it seems to be its own medium, needing no ether or other medium to transmit its influence. In this respect also, gravitation differs from the form of radiant energy, and more, it is not cut off or interfered with by any intervening body, for its force operates through such intervening bodies. For instance, in an eclipse of the sun, the moon passes between the earth and the sun, but the gravitation is not affected in the slightest, for the bodies would evidence such changes immediately were it to occur. So gravitation acts instantaneously, is its own medium, and may not be interfered with by an intervening body. It, indeed, is in a different class from light, heat, and electricity. And now let us consider the other forms of attraction. In the previous chapters we saw that the form of attraction called cohesion caused the molecules to tend to each other and to remain in more or less close contact, the differing degrees of cohesion determining the density, etc., of the body. Were the attractive force of cohesion suddenly removed, the most solid bodies as well as the lightest ones would instantly fly into very fine powder, thus being resolved into their constituent molecules. The separation of the molecules, that is, the setting further apart, occasioned by heat, is spoken of by physicists as repulsion. But the writer holds that repulsion is an entirely different thing, and that the heat merely causes the molecules to lose a portion of their attractive power for each other. Until the heat being withdrawn, the molecules respond to the uninterrupted attraction. The molecules are like lovers who are attracted toward each other and remain attached unless separated violently or by some fading of attraction. Consider heat as a disturbing element, a misunderstanding between the molecular lovers, who under its influence draw somewhat apart and are only reunited when the obstacle is removed and harmony again manifested. As we have shown you in a previous chapter, the so-called properties of matter, i.e., hardness, tenacity, malleability, ductility, etc., are simply evidence of a persistent cohesiveness of the molecules, a strong love or desire for each other that caused them to adopt every possible means in their power to resist and prevent the separation of the molecules forming the mass. It was like a desperate attempt to prevent the breaking up of the family. Each so-called special physical property of matter is seen to be but the action of the molecule resisting separation, in obedience to that law of its being called attraction, or gravitation, or cohesion, or adhesion, but which might as fitly be called desire or love. And remember that this law does not seem to be merely one of self-preservation of the molecule, for it remains intact even after the separation from its companions or family. Each so-called special physical property of matter is seen to be but the action of the molecule resisting separation, in obedience to that law of its being called attraction, or gravitation, or cohesion, or adhesion, but which might as fitly be called desire or love. And remember that this law does not seem to be merely one of self-preservation of the molecule, for it remains intact even after the separation from its companions or family. It is more, for it is a law that causes it to bend all its energies in remaining within molecular distance or close companionship with its family, and resisting disintegration. It is like the social instinct in man, if one may be pardoned from using the figure. Now for the attraction of the atoms, chemical affinity, or chemism, as it is called. An atom, you know, is the chemical unit of matter, and the smallest particle of matter that can enter into combination, leaving the corpuscle out of the consideration for the moment. These atoms exhibit and manifest an attraction for each other that causes them to form combinations or marriages, and thus to combine, forming a molecule. But remember always that when atoms combine, they do not merge their identities, they simply marry and nothing more. Each atom maintains its own identity, and is found intact if the marriage is destroyed by chemical process, which might be called the termination of the molecular marriage by divorce, that is, by one atom forsaking its mate and seeking a new affinity in the shape of some more attractive or attracting atom. For alas, the atoms are more or less fickle, and often leave their life partners for some other fascinating particle. At times there is manifested a condition of, "How happy could I be with either, were to other fair charmer away?" There is a conflict of attractions. There is more flirting and affairs of the heart in the world of atoms than in the region of the molecules, for while the latter are apt to seek only the companionship of their own family, or some nearly related family, the atoms have quite a number of possible affinities, and will invariably desert a lesser attraction for a greater one, thus forming a new molecule, and leave the deserted one to get along alone as best it may, or else form a new alliance with some other affinity who is either impervious to the attraction of the more brilliant charmer, or else is out of the danger of temptation. But if we analyze and carefully consider this chemical affinity, chemism, we will see that it comes well under the definition of attraction, as given by Webster, and quoted in the first part of this chapter. It certainly comes under the rule of the power in nature acting mutually between bodies or ultimate particles, tending to draw them together, etc. The writer thinks that he is justified in asking you to consider gravitation, cohesion, adhesion, and chemical affinity as related forms of the same thing. If you do not like to call this same thing by the name of gravitation, suppose we call it the law of attraction, of which gravitation, cohesion, adhesion, chemical affinity, or chemism are but different aspects. This relation is described in Chapter 13. And the writer believes that this law of attraction is the underlying cause of all that we call energy, force, power, motion, etc., in the physical world. For if gravitation accounts for all mass motion, or mechanical motion, if molecular cohesion, and the vibrations accompanying it, manifest in forms of molecular motion, and if atomic chemical affinity, or chemism, manifests in atomic motion, and if even the corpuscles in their movements obey this same law of attraction in some form, and if all force and energy is but a mode of motion, then, if all this be true, are we not justified in claiming that this law of attraction is the basis of all energy, force, and motion? And are we not justified in thinking of this law of attraction as always manifesting in the direction of drawing together particles of substance, be those particles suns, planets, masses, molecules, atoms, or corpuscles, in pursuance of some basic law imposed upon all things by that which is above things? The following quotation is interesting in our consideration of this subject. There are other forces besides gravity, and one of the most active of these is chemical affinity. Thus, for instance, an atom of oxygen has a very strong attraction for one of carbon, and we may compare these two atoms to the earth and a stone lodged upon the top of a house. Within certain limits this attraction is intensely powerful, so that when an atom of carbon and one of oxygen have been separated from each other, we have a species of energy of position just as truly as when a stone has been separated from the earth. Thus, by having a large quantity of oxygen and a large quantity of carbon in separate states, we are in possession of a large store of energy of position. When we allowed the stone and the earth to rush together, the energy of position was transformed into that of actual motion, and we should therefore expect something similar to happen when the separated carbon and oxygen are allowed to rush together. This takes place when we burn coal in our fires, and the primary result, as far as energy is concerned, is the production of a large amount of heat. We are, therefore, led to conjecture that heat may denote a motion of particles on the small scale, just as the rushing together of the stone and the earth denotes a motion on the large. It thus appears that we may have invisible molecular energy as well as visible mechanical energy. Balfour Stewart. To the writer it seems that the particle of substance finds within its mind principle, for you know we have seen that all substance had something akin to life and mind, a constant craving, embedded in its very nature, which causes it to seek satisfaction. This craving for satisfaction results in unrest, and seeks a solution along two lines. These two lines are indicated by two entirely different desires that it finds within itself, the first being a desire or inclination to seek the companionship of some other particle, the second being a desire or inclination to be free of attachment or entanglement. The desire for attachment arises from the force of the law of attraction that exists between each particle of substance. The desire for non-attachment arises from some inward inclination for freedom. These two desires or inclinations may be called the desire for impression and the desire for expression. The desire for impression, or pressing in, manifests along lines of action tending toward attachment, moreness, companionship, combination. The desire for expression, or pressing out, manifests along the lines of action tending toward individuality, freedom, independence, unattachment, etc. And both are strong cravings, and both tend to produce unrest, which results in motion. The pull of the desire of impression exists always, and is always modified and counteracted by the push of the desire for expression. And resulting from the play of these two desires or forces result activity, motion, and change. Like the two conflicting angels in the Persian mythology, Ahriman and Ormuzd, these two desires wrestle with each other in the theater of the universe, constant motion and change being the results. And, if the writer may be pardoned for dropping into mysticism for the moment, may it not be that these conflicting desires for separateness and unity, respectively, are but different forms of the desire for satisfaction through oneness? Impression seeks oneness by combination with other separated particles, but finds it not. Expression seeks oneness by drawing apart and endeavoring to realize it in that way, but finds it not. But both are but different aspects of the same desire for satisfaction, and only when the mind recognizes oneness in diversity does satisfaction come, and thus the lesson of the particle becomes the lesson of the man. These conflicting desires of inclinations of the particles, the one urging it along the lines of attraction, the other along the lines of separation, produce the dance of the atoms. the motion of the particles. When the particle manifests along the lines of expression, it pushes itself away from the other particle and, consequently, also pushes the other particle away. When it manifests along the lines of impression, it pulls itself toward the other particle and at the same time pulls the other particle toward itself. In both cases, the medium of the pulling extends over the space separating them, as will be described in future chapters. This pulling and pushing is called by chemistry attraction and repulsion of the particles. It is perhaps unnecessary to state that the force of the attraction of cohesion or of chemical affinity is much stronger than that of gravitation in the case of the same particles. Otherwise, if one picked up a piece of iron, the attraction of gravitation would cause its particles to separate and fall to the ground, whereas the attraction of cohesion and that of chemical affinity enable the particles to counteract the pull of gravitation and thus remain intact. Compared with cohesion or chemical affinity, the pull of gravitation is incomparably weak. The force which holds together two atoms of water represents a high degree of dynamic power, and the shock of forcible separation of chemical atoms produces something akin to an explosion. So we see that the attraction of the particles, while of the same nature as gravitation, is much higher in intensity. But notwithstanding the power of the attraction, it seems to be a matter inherent in the nature of the particle and to represent a something like will in response to desire. The varying push and pull, or the two desires, would necessarily cause a revolution of each particle on its own axis, and a revolution around each other, besides many instances of rushing together and away from each other. In these forms of motion is to be found the cause of the vibrations producing radiant energy known as light, heat, electricity, and magnetism. End of Chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of Dynamic Thought, or the Law of Vibrant Energy, by William Walter Atkinson. Chapter 11. The Theory of Dynamic Thought. From the preceding chapters we have learned that 1. The forms of force or radiant energy known as light, heat, magnetism, and electricity are modes of motion, arising from the original motion of the particles of substance, molecules, atoms, corpuscles, or electrons, and that such original motions of the particles arises from the operation of the law of attraction. 2. That the forms of attractive force or energy known as gravitation, cohesion, adhesion, atomic attraction, chemical affinity or chemism, and corpuscular attraction also arise from the operation of the law of attraction. 3. That from the above it follows that all manifestations of force and energy in inorganic substance, viz., both radiant energy in its forms of light, heat, magnetism, electricity, etc., and also attractive energy in its forms of gravitation, cohesion, adhesion, chemical affinity or atomic attraction, and corpuscular attraction, arise from the operation of the law of attraction. It will be well to remember that the fact that some of the above forms of radiant force or energy, such as heat, light, magnetism, and electricity, may arise from motion transmitted from other substance, does not alter the matter. For if they arise from waves from some other substance, it merely follows that the original motion that gave rise to the waves arose from the operation of the law of attraction. Or if they arise from interrupted motion, it merely follows that the motion that is interrupted may be traced back to original motion that arose from the operation of the law of attraction. So that all mechanical power, and all the forms of energy or force producing the same, omitting for the moment the forms of energy or force of living organisms, which will be described later on, arise from the operation of the law of attraction. Now for the next step. We have seen that the operation of the law of attraction results from vital mental action on the part of the life and mind principle inherent in the nature of the particles of substance. Consequently, all forms of energy and force arising from the operation of the law of attraction, the latter being the result of vital mental action, then it follows that all forms of energy and force having its origin in the law of attraction are manifestations of vital mental action. But this is not all, for we have not considered the energy and force abiding in and manifested by what are called living organisms, such as human, animal, and plant life, which are manifested by the physical organisms or bodies of man, animal, and plant. In order to avoid a long digression into the realms of biology, we will omit all but a passing reference to the theories that seek to identify the action of the cells of organic life with those of the particles of inorganic life. For remember that organic substance has its molecules, atoms, and corpuscles, as well as its higher combinations known as cells, and we will seek the ultimate source of all forms of force and energy exhibited by organic life in that which lies back of physical action. We need no argument here, for all will readily recognize that behind the physical action of man, animal, and plant lies life and mind, and that therefore all force and energy arising from such action must be manifestations of vital mental action. And so, summing up our conclusions regarding force and energy and motion and then in organic substance, we arrive at an understanding of the basic proposition of the theory of dynamic thought, which is as follows. Basic proposition: that all forms and exhibition of force, energy, motion, and power are manifestations of vital mental action, and that consequently at the last there is no force but vital mental force, no energy but vital mental energy, no motion but vital mental motion, no power but vital mental power. It is possible that the average reader will fail to recognize the tremendous importance of the above proposition. It is most revolutionary, and is not only directly opposed to the materialistic theory which makes matter the dominant factor, the only factor, in fact, in life, but it is also far different from the opinion of the average person who has been taught to think of blind force, dead matter, mechanical energy, power of machinery, engines, etc. And yet you are invited to go back over the path that leads up to the theory and test and examine every bit of the road for weak spots, insecure bridges, etc. The writer feels that the work will bear examination. He thinks that he has succeeded not only in proving that 1. The universe is alive and thinking, and 2. That mind is dominant, but he believes also that he has made at least partially understandable the old occult and metaphysical aphorism that has been heard so much in these later days. The statement that all is mind. Mind is all. The only fact needed now is proof of the old occult theory that matter or substance blends gradually into mind, and that in the end is found to have its origin there. So far science has not given us this proof, but it begins to look that way, although science does not dream of what lies at the end of the road she is traveling. She tells us that she sees matter melting into force or energy, and that perhaps the universe may be found to be energy or force at the last. But she ignores the fact that her investigations have already proven, to those who know how to combine them, that mind is back of force, that all force is mental force at the last. And so, you see, it is not so far a cry from matter to mind in these days of the 20th century. The bridge is being erected by the materialists, but the mentalist will be the first to cross over it. But there are many important questions ahead of us for consideration in relation to the theory of dynamic thought, and we must hasten on to them. One of the first questions that must be considered is that of the transmission of force, energy, or motion. Science has told us that light travels and is contagious, that heat travels and is contagious, that electricity travels and is contagious, that magnetism travels and is contagious, but it has failed to find evidences of cohesive force or adhesive force, or the force of gravitation, or the force of chemical affinity, or the force of corpuscular affinity being contagious. And although it recognizes that they must travel beyond the limits of the bodies manifesting them, yet it has hazarded no theory or hypothesis worthy of the name to account for the phenomenon. It informs us that light, heat, magnetism, and electricity travel via waves of the ether at the rate of 184,000 miles per second, and that when they reach their destination, the ether waves set up similar vibrations in the substance with which they come in contact. The only explanation of the method or medium of travel is the Aristotle's ether theory, which, while generally accepted as a working hypothesis, nevertheless brings a broad smile to the face of any thoughtful scientist who considers it in detail. As for the medium of the transmission of gravitation, cohesion, chemical affinity, and molecular affinity, science is mute. All that she says is that gravitation is believed to travel instantaneously over distances, that it takes light traveling at the rate of 184,000 miles per second over 2,000 years to travel. Verily, gravitation defies scientific theories and estimates and laughs at the ether. Let us see if the dynamic thought theory throws any light on the subject. The first step in the solution of the problem of the transferring and communication of energy is the remembrance of the fact that the energy is purely mental. Be it gravitation, affinity, or attraction on the one hand, or light, heat, magnetism, or electricity on the other, it is all mental force. Attraction in all of its forms has been recognized as mental action. And the vibrations that cause light, heat, magnetism, and electricity have been seen to result from the law of attraction, and therefore are mental. This being the case, would it not be wise for us to look for a solution of the transmission of force and energy in the region from which it originated, the mental region? Does not this seem reasonable? Should not the explanation for mental effects be sought in a mental cause? And should not the medium between mind and mind be looked for in the mental region? Taking the liberty of peeping into some of the succeeding chapters of this book, getting a little ahead of the story, as it were, let us consider the operation of mind in the higher forms of life. Without argument or proof at this point, let us remember the well-founded statements of fact, and the old occult teachings as well, that the mind is not confined to the limits of the body, but extends as an aura for some distance beyond its physical form. Let us also remember that the phenomena grouped together under the general subject of thought transference, thought transmission, telepathy, or the best term of all, telesthesia, meaning literally far-off sensation. The writer imagines that he hears the yell of derision go up at this point from the materialistic personage or the man on the street, who has been induced to read this book by some well-meaning friend. Thought transference, fiddlesticks, we may hear him cry in imagination. But let this reader remember, fiddlesticks or no fiddlesticks, that thought transmission is a proven fact, and that thousands of people know it to be so absolutely from their own experience. It is too late in the day for sneers at the mention of the term. Well then, since force is mental, and we are looking for a mental explanation for the phenomenon of transmission of force, does it not seem natural to consider thought transmission in that connection? Answering a possible objection of some critical reader to the effect that before a sensation may be received, the receiver must have sense organs, a very good objection, but one that is answered by science itself, let us read on. Haeckel, the distinguished scientist, in his endeavor to prove that man's senses are but a development of something in inorganic life, has called our attention to the fact that molecules and atoms are capable of receiving sensations and responding thereto. He makes quite a point of this in his latest works, and remarks, among many other things, showing his positive view on the subject of sensation in the inorganic world. I cannot imagine the simplest chemical and physical process without attributing the movements of the material particles to unconscious sensation. And again, the idea of chemical affinity consists in the fact that the various chemical elements perceive the qualitative differences in other elements, experience pleasure or revulsion at contact with them, and execute specific movements on this ground. He also quotes approvingly the remarks of Nageli, who said, if the molecules possess something that is related, however distantly, to sensation, it must be comfortable to be able to follow their attractions and repulsions, uncomfortable when they are forced to do otherwise. Haeckel also says that in his opinion the sensations in animal and plant life are connected by a long series of evolutionary stages with the simpler forms of sensation that we find in the inorganic elements, and that reveal themselves in chemical affinity. Is not this strong enough? Perhaps we may now be permitted at least to assume that even the atoms, molecules, and corpuscles have something like sensation. Someone may now object that Haeckel speaks of contact between the particles, and that sensation by contact, even in an atom, is far different from the sensation without contact at a short distance. Quite right. But if the objector will take the trouble to review the teaching of science regarding the relation of the particles, he will see that the particles are never exactly in contact except in moments of collision, which, by the way, they carefully avoid. The corpuscles, as we have shown, have plenty of room in which to move about, but they move in orbits around each other. The atoms combine, but there is always room between them, as may be seen by reference to the teachings regarding the ether, which fills up the cracks according to the theory. And the molecules also have plenty of room, as may be seen by reference to that part of the subject, particularly to the comparison of the drop of water magnified to the size of the earth, in which the molecules would appear about the size of the original drop, with more room between each than their own size. In fact, as we have been shown in a previous chapter, the particles are attracted only to a certain distance, at which they resist the impulse or attraction and stand off a bit. They will not be forced too near without creating disturbances and manifestations of force, and if they are separate beyond a certain distance, the attractive power ceases to operate. But there is always some room between them, and they bridge over that room and exert and receive the attractive power in some way. This is true not only of the particles, but of the great bodies, like the earth and planets, that are attracted and attract over great distances. Now for the question: how do they exert sense and attractive power over the great comparative distance, great comparatively as well in atom as in planet and sun? Someone may answer the question closing the last paragraph with the word electricity. Very good. Electricity, like the ether, comes in quite handy when one is forced to explain something not known. Electricity, like the glacial period, Aristotle's ether, natural laws, and suggestion, is a most handy weapon of argument and often acts as a preventative to further inquiry and investigation until some sufficiently irreverent of precedent arises to ask, but why and how, and starts the ball rolling again. But electricity will not answer in this case, for the rate of the travel of electricity is well known, 184,000 miles per second, which, fast as it is, assumes the crawl of a slow freight when compared with the instantaneous rate of travel of gravitation. And then electricity requires a medium, and gravitation does not. And in many other ways the two are seen to be totally different. And in the case of the space between the atom and molecule and corpuscle, it is no more reasonable to say electricity than it would be to say heat or light, and magnetism is not available for obvious reasons. Remember that electricity, light, and heat are caused by motion resulting from attraction, and the child cannot procreate the parent. Heat, light, and electricity may beget each other, and they do, and gravitation may procreate heat, light, and electricity, but heat, light, and electricity cannot procreate gravitation, never, and light, heat, and electricity require replenishing from the common source of energy, but gravitation is self-sufficient and asks no replenishing, or storage battery, or powerhouse. Electricity, heat, and light come and go, appearing, manifesting, and disappearing, swallowed up by each other or by substance, but gravitation is always there, unchangeable, unwavering, immutable, invariable, something above matter and force, something majestic, awe-inspiring, sublime. Does it take a wild flight of the imagination to see that this something that is not matter and not force must be a manifestation of mind? Let us first apply this idea of thought transference to the operation of the law of attraction between the corpuscles, atoms, and molecules of substance, particles of substance. Particles are believed to move to or away from each other in accordance with the workings of attraction and affinity in its varying degrees. First, they must desire to move. Not desire in the developed sense that we feel it, but still elementary feeling or inclination or tendency, call it what you will. But it remains rudimentary mental emotion, an emotion, leading to motion. This is not a pun. Look up the meaning of the word emotion and you will see its application. Then following the desire comes the action in the direction of gratifying it. The particles act to gratify desire in two ways. Acting at a distance, remember, they exert the attractive force which the writer believes to be mental force transmitted by mind, projection, a mental or psychic bond or connection being thus established. By means of this bond of mind, the particle endeavors to 1. Draw itself to the object, and 2. To draw the object toward itself. In the case of the molecule, this desire and movement seems to be mutual and evidenced by and to all molecules alike, providing they be within molecular distance, as science calls it. But in the case of the atoms it seems to be different, for there is found a greater degree of choice or elective affinity. This election or choice is not altogether free, but depends upon the relative likes and dislikes of certain kinds of elements, as we have seen in previous chapters, although to be sure these elements are all made out of the same stuff in different combinations. The details of corpuscular attraction are not known, so it cannot be told whether preferences exist, or whether, in the words of the street, all corpuscles look alike to each other. It would appear, however, that there must be some reasons for preference among the corpuscles, else they would always form in the same combinations, always act alike to each other as they are alike in other actions, and thus there would be but one element or kind of atom formed instead of the 75 already known. To be sure, in this case, it might be that the one kind of atom formed would be the atom of hydrogen, and that all other elements or atoms were modifications of that one, just proving the dream of the scientist of the 19th century. But as Kipling would say, that is another story. To return to the particle which we left trying to draw the other particle to itself and itself toward the other, There is no material connection between them, and electricity and magnetism will not answer. So what is to be done? Evidently the particle knows, for it exerts a drawing power or force by means of the mental connection, and the two come together. The particle evidently is able to exert a repelling or moving away power by reversing the process, the mental bond acting as the medium. This may cause a smile because we have never seen an instance of bodies pulling themselves together by intangible bonds. Haven't we? Then how about two pieces of magnetized steel or two electrified substances? Oh, that's different, you say. Why different? Isn't the bond intangible? And haven't we seen that both electricity and magnetism were mental actions also? Yes, that's it. Perhaps the attracting force is magnetism or electricity. No, that will not do, for we have seen that electricity and magnetism were products of this attraction, not producers of it. The attraction must come before electricity and magnetism, not after them. You are mixing cause and effect. And even if you were right, and you cannot be, wouldn't the electrical or magnetic force be called into operation and directed by the mental action arising from the desire? You cannot get away from mental action when you study the law of attraction. But how about the fact that the heat causes particles to change their vibrations and draw apart, and all that sort of thing, and electricity likewise, you may ask? Surely this takes the matter away from mental action, doesn't it? Well, the writer thinks that the phenomenon referred to only helps prove his theory, and he will endeavor to so prove to you. The consideration of the facts related in this chapter leads us to a supplemental proposition to our basic proposition, which may be stated as follows. Supplemental Proposition 1. Not only is the law of attraction the manifestation of a mental process or vital mental action, but also the actual force or energy used in bringing the particles of substance in closer relation in accordance with that law is in its nature a vital mental force or energy operating between bodies or particles of substance without a material medium. End of Chapter 11.
Chapter 12. The Law of Vibrant Energy. In previous chapters, we have seen that the phenomena of radiant energy, known as light, heat, magnetism, and electricity, had their origin in the motion of the particles. The different classes of phenomena depending upon the particular degree and nature of the aforesaid motion of particles. We have seen also that radiant energy could be communicated or transmitted from one body of substance to another, and that the communication of transmission might be accomplished not only by close contact of the bodies, but by waves of some sort which were caused in some medium, the ether, by the vibrations of the particles of the body, and which waves, when they reached the other body, were transformed into vibrations of the particles corresponding to those manifested in the first body. The idea has been illustrated by the sending telephone, the sound waves in the diaphragm of which were transformed into waves of the electric current, and thus passing along the wires were transformed again into sound waves by the diaphragm of the receiving instrument. We have seen also in the preceding chapter that the medium by which these vibrations were transferred, transmitted, or communicated might be supposed to be mind, the operation being akin to thought transference. Now, let us examine into the workings of the matter. In the first place, we assume a certain state of vibration existing in a certain body of substance, heat or electricity, for instance. Either illustration will answer. Another body of substance is brought in close contact with the first body, and the vibrations of energy pass on to the second, not by waves, but by a seeming actual passing of vibrations without the need of intervening waves. This science calls transmission by conduction, the theory being that the particles rapidly pass on the vibrations from one to another. Convection or conduction, along other forms of substance such as hot air, hot water, steam, etc., is but a variation of the above, as substance is the medium in both cases. The third form of transmission is by radiation, whereby the vibrations are transmitted by waves in some medium other than substance, according to the theory, as we have described in a preceding paragraph, as well as in previous chapters. As a matter of fact, a careful analysis of the matter will show that even in the conduction of the most solid substance, there must be a medium, not substance, between the particles of the substance, for the particles always have space between them, this being true of the particles of air as well as those of iron. So there is always space to be traversed by a medium, not substance. But we need not stop to split hairs regarding this question, for the general explanation will explain this also. Now, to get back to our body of substance vibrating with radiant energy, separated from a second body of substance by a great distance, thousands of miles, in fact. Millions would be better. Let us take two worlds, for instance, the sun and the earth, ignoring for the moment the explanation of gravitations, which will be given later, and realizing that there is no medium of substance existing between the two bodies. We must grant that there is a medium, not substance, existing between them, either permanently or thrown out for the purpose of this special transmission. We shall assume a medium existing before the need of the transmission, for reasons to be seen later. Our theory of dynamic thought and thought transference between bodies of substance compels us to suppose that this medium is a mental connection or mental relation existing between the two bodies of substance. So, we must consider the question of this medium of mind transmitting the vibrations of radiant energy from the sun to the earth. How can mind conduct radiant energy? It does not conduct radiant energy, but it does transmit, not radiant energy, but the mental state that causes radiant energy vibrations. This statement of a mental state causing radiant energy vibrations seems rather startling at first sight, but let us examine it. We have seen that the radiant energy was caused by the motion or vibrations of the particles, which motion or vibration was the result of the workings of the law of attraction, and which law was but the manifestation of vital mental action. And at the last, the vibrations of radiant energy are the result of peculiar or particular states of the life and mind of the particle. The word state is derived from the Latin word status, meaning position, standing, and is used generally in the sense of condition. This mental state of the particle may be described as a state of emotional excitement. Let us pause a moment to consider the meaning of these words. It often helps us to understand a subject if we examine the real meaning of the words defining it. Emotion is derived from the Latin word emotum, meaning to shake, to stir up, the Latin word being made up of two other words, i.e., e meaning out and motum, to move. Emotion is defined as a moving or excitement of the mind. Excitement is derived from the Latin word excitare, meaning to move out, the English word being defined as a calling to activity, state of active feeling, aroused activity. So you see that the idea of active motion and aroused activity of mind permeates the term emotional excitement that is used by the writer in connection with the mental state causing vibration of the particles of substance. The single word, excitement, will be used by the writer hereafter in the above connection. in order to avoid complex terms. To those who still object to the use of a mental term in reference to motion of substance, he might remark that science makes use of the term excite and excitement in reference to electrical phenomena, so that he is not altogether without support in the use of the word. Now, to return again to our body of substance, the sun, the particles of which are manifesting a great degree of excitement, evidencing in vibrations producing the phenomena of radiant energy. The excitement is shared equally by its particles, the contagion having spread among them. Even the particles of its atmosphere are vibrating with excitement and evidencing radiant energy. The sun is in direct mental connection with the earth, as we shall see presently, and the excitement is transmitted by thought transference along this mental connection in the shape of dynamic thought waves of excitement. These waves have a rate of speed of 184,000 miles per second. Why this particular rate, or any rate at all, is not apparent, it being very evident. However, that this particular kind of mental action, excitement, or thought is not transmitted instantaneously, as is the mental quality known as desire, resulting in attraction or gravitation, which seems to be rather a basic quality rather than a temporary disturbance or emotional excitement. But the writer must not get ahead of his story. The excitement of the particles of substance composing the sun is contagious, and the thought waves travel along the mental connection or medium at a wonderful rate of speed. Soon they come in contact with the mental atmosphere of the earth, and the excitement becomes manifest in action. The emotional excitement being reproduced by the particles of the earth's substance nearest the surface, which vibrate and manifest the radiant energy in spite of themselves, for the tendency among particles is to settle down and remain calm, rather than to participate in emotional excitement. They have acquired a normal and fixed rate of vibration or mental state, after many years, gradually changing from a high state of excitement to a comparative calm state, and their tendency and inclination is conservative, and they are disposed to resent and repel radical states of excitement or disturbance coming from other less conservative bodies. The above fact partially explains why the communicated excitement manifests itself more strongly on the surface of the body exposed to the contagion of excitement. The conservative influence is always at work and manages to absorb and equally distribute the energy that is beating down upon it without allowing it to penetrate very far. The energy is used up or absorbed and neutralized by the lower vibrations of the mass. The effort of the energy coming from the sending body is to bring up the vibrations of the receiving body to the rate of the sender, while the effort of the receiving body is to resist this effort and to reduce and bring down the transmitted increased rate of vibration of the particles immediately exposed to the contagion. In both cases, the effort is toward equalization of the rate of vibrations. This working of the law may be observed plainly in the case of heat vibrations, the energy seeming to wish to bring up the vibrations or temperature of the second body, while the latter resists this effort and strives to bring down the vibrations or temperature of those particles of itself that have caught the motion. The energy is like a radical agitator who wishes to stir up an excitement leading to a change, while the body is like the conservative element that prefers to let well enough alone and resists the stirring up process and exerts itself to restore quiet and to maintain accustomed conditions. The explanation of the phenomenon given in any work on physics or natural philosophy will answer fairly well in the consideration of this theory of dynamic thought. The only important change being required being the substitution of thought waves for waves of the ether of science. Science has described the working operations as might be expected from her years of careful study and examination. She has erred only in the theory or hypothesis advanced to account for the facts. Her ether, handed down by Aristotle, is admitted by her to be paradoxical and unthinkable, but she has had none other to substitute for it. She'll probably sneer at the dynamic thought and thought transference theory advanced in this book, if indeed she takes the trouble to examine it. But sometime, from her own ranks, among her most advanced members, will arise a man who will claim that all force is mental force, and that transference of energy is thought transference, and the scientific world will accept the doctrine after it finds itself unable to fight it down, and it will give new names and terms to its workings, and it will proclaim loudly the new truth. And this little book and its writer will be ignored, but its work will go on. The writer, although probably doomed to have himself and his theory laughed at by the masses of people whose children will accept the teachings of this book, does not feel discouraged by the prospect. He cares nothing for personal credit, the truth being the important thing. Like Galvini, whose words appear on the title page of this book, he may cry, "I am attacked by two very opposite sects, the scientists and the know-nothings. Both laugh at me, calling me the frog's dancing master, but I know that I have discovered one of the greatest forces in nature." The illustration given above of the transmission of the excitement of the particles of the sun to the particles of the earth will answer equally well in the case of light, heat, magnetism, and electricity, and it will answer in the case of the transmission of these forces between atoms, molecules, and masses, as well as between worlds and solar systems. Any body subject to the law of attraction may, and do, so transmit vibrations. In our consideration of the riddle of the Sphinx, which forms the subject of the next chapter, we shall obtain further particulars of the workings of the law. The consideration of the facts and principles stated in this chapter brings us to a second supplemental proposition, which may be stated as follows. Supplemental Proposition 2. The rates of vibration of the particles of substance may be likened to mental states, and a high degree of the same may be called an excitement. This excitement may be, and is, communicated from the particles of the body manifesting it to the particles of other bodies, the medium of such communication being a mental connection or mental relation existing between the two bodies of substance, without the employment of any material medium, and which excitement, so communicated, reproduces in the second body the vibrations manifested in the first body, subject always to the counteracting efforts of the second body to maintain its accustomed and former rate of vibration and mental state. End of chapter 12.